For our bonus week material, we're going to think about the economic history of the 1918 influenza pandemic, which seems particularly fitting because the reason we need a bonus week is because of the COVID-19 pandemic we're facing right now. So the economic history of the 1918 influenza pandemic actually has a lot of lessons to teach us about what we might be facing during this pandemic and how pandemics in the past really reshaped the global economy. So in this first video, I just want to give you some historical context of what this pandemic was like, how rapidly it spread, how widely it spread, and how lethal it was, and put that in the context of other historical pandemics and our current crisis. So what we're starting with here is a photograph from Camp Funston in Kansas. And so Kansas is really going to be the epicenter of the first wave of this great influenza pandemic of 1918. So as this pandemic spreads throughout the country, what we get is something that looks very similar to what you're facing right now with COVID-19. So here you have the Seattle Daily Times. You've got this headline that churches, schools, shows closed, right? So the approach to the pandemic then, very much the same as now. We didn't have a vaccine, and so what you could do was essentially socially distance and wear masks. And that's exactly what they did. It's exactly what we're doing. So we've shut down these sorts of businesses. We've gone on to mask wearing. Very much the same thing that we were doing in 1918 when this influenza pandemic spread through the world. So just to give you kind of even more similarities to what we're talking to and facing today, here you've got another Seattle newspaper article that's featuring the various fashions that have evolved from the mask wearing mandates in the city. And so as much as this is 100 years ago, it should look oddly familiar to you today. People wearing different styles of face masks, wearing them to different levels of effectiveness, and even having their own face masks with their political campaigns slogan across them, as you see the "To hell with the Kaiser" mask up there on the right. So this pandemic was truly global in nature. As I mentioned, it's going to start in Kansas, and so here we are in the Midwest here. And in the early spring of 1918, this is the first wave of the pandemic. It's going to spread basically through some of these military camps. We're talking about World War I here. And so that really facilitates the spread to different bases and then to Europe and Asia and South America and the rest of the globe. Okay, so starting in Kansas around March, and then in April and May, really reaching the rest of the world here. It's actually not this first wave that we're going to be focused on. This first wave is a big outbreak of the flu, but it's not what leads to this being sort of a historic pandemic. It's the second wave that's going to do that. So what happens is the flu makes it to Europe in the spring, and then it starts circulating through Europe, all right? And then it comes back to the United States. Right? And this is why we're calling it the Spanish flu as opposed to the Kansas flu. Okay? So it's this second wave that comes back to the United States. Right? So now we're in the autumn of 1918, and the flu's come to Europe, and now it's going to start spreading back out of Europe. It's going to come back into the United States in early September. Then other places are going to get hit by late September, and then by October, it's pretty much spread back through the United States. And this time it's different. This second wave proves to be incredibly deadly. And so it takes a devastating toll on the US population, and this second wave turns out to be deadly across the entire globe. So if we think about the worldwide diffusion of that second wave, it's really hitting everywhere. So that second wave is coming out of Europe. It's making it to the United States by September. October is a really bad month. It's making it to the rest of the world largely by October and November. Okay? So that second wave is really concentrated in the fall, and that's going to be important when we start talking about the economic history of these impacts. So to put the severity of the flu in context, let's think about its contagiousness and its lethality. So what you've got here is actually a figure from the New York Times thinking about those two dimensions for COVID-19. And that's what this red box is representing here, because we still have a lot of uncertainty. We still have a lot of competing estimates of how contagious and how lethal COVID-19 is. The way we're thinking about contagiousness on this graph is on the horizontal axis, And what we're looking at is the average number of people infected by each sick person. Okay, so if I get the flu, am I going to pass that flu on to one person, 4 people, 10 people? The more people I pass it on to, the faster this thing can spread, right? The more contagious it is. So chickenpox and measles here are notorious for how contagious they are. So each person with chickenpox is going to infect another 8 people. So you can imagine how rapidly and widely that's going to spread. Measles, truly frightening disease, 15 people infected by each person that gets it. So that's truly horrifying in terms of numbers. Okay? If you think about us being on essentially lockdown now, us learning virtually, right? That's due to COVID-19 spreading, where each person's infecting roughly 2 to 3 additional people. Okay? So once again, putting chickenpox and measles in context here, those were truly terrible. The 1918 influenza pandemic, that's the Spanish flu here, you can see it's pretty similar to COVID-19. All right, so we're talking about a similar contagiousness, and we have a global pandemic now. We had a global pandemic in 1918. What's a bit different, thankfully, between the 1918 influenza pandemic and our current issues with COVID-19 is the lethality, how fatal it is when you get the flu. So our estimates for COVID-19 still bounce around a lot, but the percent chance of dying after contracting COVID-19 is somewhere between 0.1 and about 3% here. Okay, so that's the fatality rate as a percentage. For the Spanish flu, it was higher. It was about 10, which is really dramatically high for a flu. Okay? So to give you kind of an even better sense of that, we can think of some of the other famous influenza pandemics of the past. The Asian flu of 1957-58, the Hong Kong flu in the late 60s, right? Those were deadly pandemics, but they paled in comparison to the number of deaths from Spanish influenza, from that 1918 strain of the flu. So you've got tens of millions of people, right? No matter what sort of estimates you use here, these are from different papers on the 1918 pandemic, but regardless of the estimates you use, tens of millions of people throughout the world dying, and that's based on 1918 population, right? So tens of millions is huge in percentage terms. Compare that to the Asian flu and Hong Kong flu, both pretty famous pandemics, and those are the order of 1 to 2 million deaths. Typical flu season down here on the order of 500,000 deaths. Okay? So that tells you just how deadly and how massive the mortality consequences of this 1918 pandemic were. So another way to kind of put that in perspective is to look at mortality over time in the United States. So what you've got in the darker shaded line here is mortality from all causes. And mortality from all causes can be split up into infectious diseases and non-infectious diseases. One of the truly great things we've done over the 20th century, one of the things that's actually really benefited our economy tremendously, is that we've developed the medical technology and the public health institutions to get infectious disease under control. So you can see back in 1900, infectious disease accounted for roughly half of all mortality. And now it accounts for an incredibly small fraction of mortality. Our medical technology is just far better. Our understanding of viruses is far better. Our understanding of vaccination and antibiotics and all these other things, right, is stuff we did not have available to us in 1900. So in general, this should be a happy looking picture for you, right? We've gotten infectious disease under control. That's one of the great accomplishments of mankind over the 20th century. But this figure also points out just how dramatic that influenza pandemic was. You can see the clear spike here in 1918 in mortality, and since it's coming from that influenza pandemic, it's all coming through that infectious disease mortality, right? But that's an extraordinary spike in mortality. No other pandemic, no other outbreak in this entire century comes anywhere close to what that looks like, right? So that's why it's such a big focus of study in economic history. It's this really dramatic, really rapid, really short event that was unanticipated that led to horrible levels of mortality and morbidity among the global population. And so the questions economic historians have is when you have such a big negative health shock to the population, what happens? What happens to the economy in the short run? What happens to the people that survive that pandemic in the long run? What happens to their skills, their health, their productivity, their well-being over time? That's what we're going to try to figure out by looking at 3 different papers on the economic history of the 1918 influenza pandemic.